A dock worker helped a billionaire with her flat tire. The next day, a black SUV showed up at his house. He was walking his 8-year-old daughter to school when it arrived. She saw it first. She always noticed things first. That was her way. She slipped her hand into his and looked up at him, not frightened, just watching his face to decide how to feel. He kept walking. He didn't look at the car, but she felt something move through his hand. A stillness, the kind that isn't calm so much as practiced, and she held on tighter without knowing why. He dropped her at the school gate. She turned back once. He was already facing the car. He was a dock worker. He managed cargo manifests at a commercial port. He knew the names of the ships by the sound of their horns, and he walked his daughter along the harbor every evening so she could learn them too. He was unremarkable in every way that the world uses to measure men. He was also, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, something else entirely. The man who stepped out of that SUV knew what he was looking at. He didn't offer a threat. He offered a file folder. And in that folder was a photograph taken 7 years ago of the man standing in front of him. Same face. Different world. Standing on the deck of a rescue vessel in the South Atlantic, surrounded by 30 people who were alive because of him. The dock worker looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he looked back at the school gate where his daughter had been standing. She was gone. She trusted him to follow. If you believe that the most extraordinary people are often the ones carrying the heaviest things in silence, stay with this story. Because what happens next will remind you why quiet strength is the most powerful kind there is. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, has someone ever surprised you by being so much more than they appeared? Tell me about it below. But to understand who this man really was and what it cost him to become someone the world had never heard of, we need to go back 2 days. To a flat tire. An empty road. And the moment a billionaire looked at a dock worker's hands and knew something wasn't adding up, the port woke before the city did. By 5 in the morning, the cranes were already moving. Thomas Aubert stood at the manifest station near Gate 7. His jacket collar turned up against the salt wind coming off the water. He had a clipboard in one hand and a coffee in the other, and he was reading the incoming cargo list, the way most people read nothing completely, without effort, catching everything. He found the error on the 3rd line. Container Batch 7 Delta was logged for berth 12. Berth 12 was occupied until noon. The crane schedule had the batch slotted for 9. That meant a 3-hour bottleneck, 2 delayed departures, and a Port Authority fine if the Meridian Star missed her tide window. Thomas crossed out the berth number, wrote 9 Bravo above it, and moved the crane slot to 7:15. He initialed the correction and clipped the sheet to the top of the stack. 14 minutes later, his supervisor arrived. Henri Must was a thick man with a short neck and a habit of looking at the dock as though it owed him something. He picked up the manifest without greeting Thomas, scanned it, and nodded at the correction as though he had made it himself. "Good catch on the berth conflict," he said to the crane operator standing nearby. "I moved Delta to 9 Bravo. Should keep us clean till noon." The crane operator glanced at Thomas. Thomas looked at his clipboard. "Yes, sir," the operator said. Mast walked away. Thomas wrote nothing down, said nothing, and moved to the next sheet. The Meridian Star would make her tide window. That was the point. The name on the correction didn't change anything about the water or the wind or the weight of the containers. It didn't change anything about the morning. He finished the manifest review by 6. The cranes moved where he'd directed them. The dock ran cleanly, the way it always ran when Thomas had touched the schedule first. He carried his empty coffee cup to the bin near the water's edge and stood for a moment, looking out. The harbor in early light was a different thing than the harbor at noon. The water was dark gray and very still. The ships sat heavy and patient on it. He knew most of them by name, without looking the outline of a hull, the particular angle of a funnel, the color of a flag at the stern. He had known ships this way since he was 23 years old. He had known them from much farther out than this. He picked up his clipboard and went back to work. At 7:40 he collected his bag, clocked out, and walked the 15 minutes to Cleo's school. This was the arrangement. He started early enough to finish, early enough to walk her through the Port District on the way. It added time. He had never once minded. She was waiting at the corner where he always found her, her backpack pulling her shoulders back, her dark eyes already scanning the water beyond the rooftops. "The one at berth 4, she said before he reached her. He looked. The ship at berth 4 was a mid-sized bulk carrier, rust along the waterline, a Greek flag. "The Aegean Promise," he said. She repeated it carefully. "Aegean Promise." Then, where has she been? Thessaloniki, probably. Maybe Istanbul. He took her backpack strap and adjusted it without being asked. "She's carrying grain. You can tell by the draft." Cleo looked at the waterline, trying to see what he saw. She didn't ask him to explain draft. She filed it away and would ask later when she'd had time to think of the right question. That was her way. They walked the remaining block. He watched her go through the school gate, and she turned once, the way she always did, and he raised one hand. She raised hers back and disappeared inside. He stood there for a moment after she was gone. Not long. Just a breath. Then he turned and walked back toward the port. The morning had warmed slightly. The cranes were moving on schedule. He could hear the Meridian Star's engine turning over as she prepared to leave berth 12, right on time. He was halfway down the dock road when he noticed the car. It was parked in the executive access lane, a lane for port management and visiting inspectors, not for commercial vehicles, a black sedan. Long, quiet, and still, with German plates and tinted rear windows that caught the light without giving anything back. It hadn't been there at 6. He would have noted it at 6. Thomas looked at it for exactly as long as it took him to register the plates, the model, the angle of the wheels pointed toward the exit, not the port. Whoever was in it wasn't here for the dock. He looked away. He marked something on his clipboard that didn't need marking. The car didn't move. He walked past it and went back to work, and the feeling that stayed with him wasn't alarm. It was something quieter than that, something closer to recognition. He had seen cars like that before, in a different life, in a different city. They had sometimes been waiting for him. The access road ran along the back edge of the terminal, between the port fence and a row of storage sheds that blocked the afternoon sun. Most workers used it only to reach the car park. It was not the kind of road anyone chose to stop on. The car was a dark blue sedan, pulled half onto the gravel shoulder. Both hazard lights were blinking. Thomas saw it from 50 meters away and adjusted his path without thinking about it. She was standing beside the rear passenger tire, which had come apart at the sidewall. Not a slow leak. A full blowout. The woman was in her 60s, dressed in a gray wool coat that was too good for a port visit, and she was looking at the tire with the particular expression of someone who solves problems for a living and has briefly encountered one she cannot solve. She had her phone in her hand, but she wasn't using it. Thomas set down his bag. He didn't ask if she needed help. He crouched beside the tire, confirmed what he could already see, and straightened up. "Do you have the boot key?" he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The boot." "The trunk. The spare will be underneath." She pressed a button on the key fob. The trunk released. Thomas moved to the back of the car, lifted the floor panel, and found the spare. He lifted it out and set it upright, then took his pressure gauge from his jacket pocket and checked the valve. He stopped. "This is at 40 psi, he said. "It needs 80. She came around to look. The rental company checked it this morning. They didn't check this one." He set the spare on the gravel and looked at her. "Do you have a pump or a kit?" "I don't know what's in the car." He went back to the boot and found the emergency kit behind the false panel. There was a small electric compressor inside, the kind that plugged into the car's power socket. He set it up without comment. connected it to the spare, and listened to it run while he pulled the jack from its housing. The woman watched him work. She didn't make conversation, which he appreciated. She stood a few steps back and watched the way people watch things that interest them, not politely, but with attention. He jacked the car, removed the blown tire, mounted the spare, and torqued the lug nuts in the cross pattern that distributed load evenly. The whole process took 9 minutes. He had done it faster, but the gravel shoulder was uneven, and he took his time on the lug nuts. The compressor finished. He checked the spare's pressure again. 82 psi. He lowered the jack and stowed it. "Don't go above 80 kilometers on this," he said. "It's a temporary spare. It'll hold, but not above 80. He picked up his bag. "There's a garage on Rue de la Joliette, 2 blocks from the port gate. They'll fit a full replacement this evening if you go now." She looked at him for a moment. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." "That's not how this works." "It's how this one works," he said. He picked up his bag and walked. She stood beside the car and watched him go. He didn't look back. His walk was even, unhurried, the same pace it always was, and something about that bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately name. She looked down at the mounted spare, then at the blown tire he had left standing neatly against the fence so it wouldn't roll, then at the jack, which he had stowed correctly, then at the pressure gauge he had used, which he had put back in his own pocket. She looked at the ID badge clipped to his jacket. She had a practiced eye for details. She had built a company on it. She raised her phone and spoke into it. "Find me the name of the manifest coordinator at the Marseille South Terminal, the one with Gate 7 access." Thomas walked the 20 minutes home the way he always walked it, through the Port District streets where the bars were just opening and the last delivery trucks were finishing their routes. The evening smelled of salt and diesel and something frying in one of the buildings above him. He stopped at the corner shop and bought bread and a piece of cheese wrapped in paper and a small bar of chocolate that he put in his jacket pocket for Cleo. She was already asleep when he got in. She fell asleep early on school nights, usually with a book open beside her and the lamp still on. He turned off the lamp and picked the book up from where it had fallen against her arm and put it on the nightstand. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, ate standing at the counter, and took his coffee out to the small balcony that faced the water. The harbor lights were on. The ships moved very slowly, or not at all. From this distance, at this hour, they looked like they were simply resting on the surface of something much larger than themselves. He sat there until the coffee was gone. Then he went to bed, and the night was quiet, and in the morning the black SUV was waiting outside his building. He woke before the alarm, the way he always did. The apartment was still dark. Cleo's school bag was by the door where he had set it the night before, her jacket folded on top of it, her shoes lined up underneath. He made coffee, ate a piece of bread standing at the kitchen window, and watched the sky go from black to gray over the rooftops. By 7, they were out the door. Cleo walked with her hands in her pockets and her chin slightly down, which meant she was thinking about something and would tell him when she was ready. He didn't press. They passed the bakery on Rue Bernard, and the smell of warm bread followed them half a block. She reached up and took his hand at the corner without looking at him, the way she had done since she was 3 years old, automatic as breathing. He dropped her at the gate. She turned back once. He raised his hand. Then he walked home. The SUV was parked in front of his building. It was the same model as the car he had noticed in the port's executive lane the previous morning. Black, German-made, tinted windows. It was positioned with its nose pointing out, not in the habit of someone who preferred to leave quickly. Thomas noted this without slowing his pace. The driver's door opened as he reached the front step. The man who stepped out was in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with short gray hair and a face that gave nothing away easily. He was dressed plainly dark jacket, no tie, and he moved with the careful economy of someone trained to appear less large than he was. He carried a file folder under one arm and held a business card between two fingers. "Mr. Aubert," he said. His French was accented. "German, or perhaps Swiss. My name is Karl Dietrich. I work for Renata Kloss." Thomas stopped on the bottom step. He looked at the card, then at the man. "I know who she is," Thomas said. Karl nodded. He didn't offer the card yet. "We have a situation. I'd like to explain it to you if you'll give me 5 minutes." The street was quiet. A woman walked past with a small dog. A motor scooter idled at the far end of the block. Thomas looked at Karl Dietrich and saw a man who was not here to threaten him. That was clear. Men who came to threaten didn't stand on the pavement at 7:45 in the morning holding file folders. They came differently. "Say it here," Thomas said. Karl accepted this without argument. He opened the folder. "One of our vessels went dark 18 hours ago. A storm corridor off the Corsican coast. She was carrying 34 crew members." He turned the top sheet to face Thomas. It was a ship registration document. The vessel's name was printed at the top in bold type. "Our crisis team has been working through the night. They're deadlocked." Thomas looked at the name on the document. M.V. Adele. His eyes stayed on it for a moment longer than they should have. He was aware of this. He made himself look at the rest of the page. Gross tonnage, flag, state. Last known position. He read each line, not because he needed to, but because it gave his face something to do. "How did my name come up?" he said. Karl turned to the second document in the folder. He held it so Thomas could see it clearly. It was a photograph. Thomas recognized it immediately. Not the image itself, but the occasion. A vessel deck in the South Atlantic, winter light, 6 years ago or 7. He was standing at the rail in an Imro jacket, and behind him were 31 people who had been in the water for 11 hours before he found them. The commendation letter was clipped to the photograph. He could see his name printed on it, and below it the names of both organizations that had signed it. The wind moved along the street. Somewhere above them a shutter banged once against a window frame. "We were thorough," Karl said. He said it without apology. Thomas closed the folder and held it out. Karl took it. "I manage cargo manifests," Thomas said. "I check berth schedules. That's my job." "I understand." "Then you understand my answer." Karl took the folder. He looked at Thomas for a moment, not with pressure, not with argument. Just looking. Then he placed the business card on the iron railing at the base of the steps. "The window for the crew is narrowing," he said. "That's not a threat. It's just true." He got back into the SUV. The second door closed. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and moved to the end of the block, turned left, and was gone. Thomas stood on the step. The street was ordinary again. The woman with the small dog had reached the far corner. The scooter was gone. A cloud shifted, and the morning light came through flat and pale between the buildings, the way it did in autumn when the sky couldn't quite commit. He looked at the card on the railing. M.V. Adele. He picked up the card. He went inside. He walked past the coat rack, past the kitchen table, past Cleo's drawing of a ship that was still on the refrigerator door where she had taped it last week. He opened the kitchen drawer. He put the card inside. He did not throw it away. Cleo went to bed at 8:30. Thomas waited until he heard her breathing change through the thin wall between their rooms, that slow, heavy rhythm that meant she was fully under. Then he went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a while, not doing anything in particular. The card was still in the drawer. He didn't open the drawer. After a time, he went to the bedroom and crouched beside the bed and pulled out the storage box from underneath it. It was a gray metal case, the kind used for documents or tools, with a combination lock that he opened without hesitating. He set it on the bed and lifted the lid. The smell reached him first. Old paper and something faintly chemical. The ink from carbon copy logs, the kind Imro had still been using in the early years. He hadn't opened the box in 14 months. The smell was the same as it had always been. The operational logs were on top, bundled with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. He set them aside without opening them. Beneath them was a folder, and inside the folder were the commendation's 2 documents, each on heavy institutional paper, each bearing the seal of a different maritime organization. His name was printed on both. The citations below his name described, in careful formal language, events that he remembered in an entirely different way. He put the folder on the bed beside the logs. Beneath the folder were the photographs. He didn't take them out all at once. He lifted the first one and held it in the light from the bedside lamp. Adele, in a hospital chair with Cleo asleep across her lap. Cleo had been 2 years old. Adele's hair was gone by then, and she had wound a blue scarf around her head, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough, like she was deciding whether to bother. He set the photograph down. He had met Adele in Lisbon in 2008, during a layover between operations. He had been 30 years old, and she had been 29, and she was sitting at a restaurant bar reading a structural engineering textbook and eating olives, and he had asked her what she was studying, and she had said, without looking up, that she wasn't studying, she was reviewing, and there was a difference. He had found this so interesting that he sat down, and they had talked for 4 hours, and he had missed his flight back to the operations base and had considered, for the first time in his adult life, that a flight might not be the most important thing in a room. He had called his supervisor the next morning. He had still gone back. But things had been different after that. By 2009, he was leading operations. By 2012, he was directing the most complex search and rescue coordination in IMRO's Mediterranean division. He could hold a live rescue in his head the way other people held conversations. All the voices, all the moving pieces, all the contingencies branching outward in real time. His colleague said he never looked at the chart the way normal coordinators did. He looked at the water. 14 operations. 212 crew members recovered. 11 of those operations were conducted in conditions classified as severe or extreme. He had not thought about those numbers in a long time. Thinking about them required also thinking about the day the numbers stopped. It was a Tuesday. Adele had gone alone to the appointment because he was mid-operation off the coast of Sardinia, and she hadn't wanted to wait, and she hadn't wanted to call him until she knew something certain. She called him that evening when he was writing the incident report. She told him what the doctor had said. She told him in the same tone she used for most things, clear, direct, no performance. Then she asked him to come home. He filed his resignation the next morning. His supervisor asked if he needed time to think about it. Thomas said no. The decision had been made the evening before, on the phone, listening to Adele breathe between sentences. He had not worked a rescue operation since. After she died, the dock job had made sense in a way he hadn't needed to analyze. The water was there. The ships were there. He could read a manifest the way he had once read current charts, and nobody needed anything more from him than that. And every evening he was home for Cleo. That was the arrangement. It was a good arrangement. He put the photographs back in the box. He put the folder on top of them. He put the operational logs on top of the folder. He closed the lid and pressed the lock until it clicked. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while with the box beside him. Then he reached under and slid it back into place and stood and turned off the lamp and went to the kitchen to make tea he didn't particularly want. The drawing was on the refrigerator. He had seen it every morning for 2 weeks without fully registering it. He registered it now. Cleo had drawn it in blue crayon on a piece of school paper, slightly wobbly lines, a ship with a tall smokestack and small waves underneath it. She had written the label at the bottom in careful capital letters, the way she wrote everything. Papa's boat. He had never told her about the boats. He managed cargo manifests. He checked birth schedules. That was the story he lived, and it was the only story she had ever heard. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the drawing. Then he went to the drawer. He opened it. He picked up Carl Dietrich's card and turned it over in his hand and read the number on the back, and did not put it down. He picked her up at the school gate at 3:15, the way he always did. The afternoon had warmed. The streets near the old harbor smelled of salt and coffee from the cafe on the corner, and the light came in low and gold off the water. Cleo fell into step beside him without needing to be told where they were going. They always went to the harbor wall on days like this. It was their place in the same unspoken way that the kitchen table was their place for breakfast, and the small balcony was his place alone after she slept. They found their usual stretch of wall and sat. The old harbor spread out before them, calm and glittering, the pleasure boats rocking gently on the late afternoon chop. Cleo put her school bag between her feet and looked at the water. They sat like that for a while without talking. Then she said, "I saw the man from the window." Thomas looked at her. "Which window?" "The classroom window, the one that faces the street." She picked at the strap of her bag. "He had a black car. Was he there for you?" "Yes," Thomas said. She thought about this. "Why?" He looked back at the water. A fishing boat was making its way toward the mouth of the harbor, its engine a low rumble that he felt as much as heard. "Someone needed help with something," he said. "Something I used to do." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing information away. She didn't ask what the something was. That was the thing about Cleo. She knew the difference between a door that was closed and a door that was locked. She didn't rattle either one. They watched the fishing boat pass. After a while, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a printout, the kind that came off the school library printer. She unfolded it and smoothed it on her knee. "We read this in class," she said, "about a boat that got lost." He looked at the printout. It was a news article, 2 weeks old, about a small fishing vessel that had gone missing off the coast near Marseille. 3 crew members. They had been found after 4 days by a Coast Guard cutter working a widened search pattern. "They found them," she said. "It says so at the bottom." "Good." She folded the paper again, carefully along the same creases. She looked at the harbor. "Do the people on the boats know someone is looking for them?" she said. Thomas went still. It was a simple question. She had read an article. She was 8 years old, and she was asking the obvious thing, the thing that a child would wonder whether the people lost at sea knew, somehow, that someone was out there working to find them, whether they felt it, whether the search reached them even before the rescuers did. She did not know about the MV Adele. She did not know about 34 crew members in a storm corridor off the Corsican coast. She was asking about the fishermen in the newspaper. Thomas looked at the water for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Someone always looks." She nodded. She seemed satisfied by this, not because it was comforting, but because it was a fact, and she preferred facts. A gull landed on the wall 10 meters away and regarded them without interest. Thomas sat with the card in his mind. He had left it in the kitchen drawer that morning. He had walked past the drawer twice before leaving the apartment and had not opened it. He stood up. "Wait here," he said. He moved to the far end of the wall, away from the foot traffic, and took out his phone. He dialed the number from memory. He had read it often enough. Carl Dietrich answered on the second ring. Thomas spoke first. "One condition," he said. "I answer to no one in her institutional chain, not her directors, not her crisis team. I work directly. If that changes, I stop." A pause on the line. "Not long." "Agreed," Carl said. Thomas hung up. He walked back to where Cleo was sitting. She was watching the gull, which had moved closer. She had her hands folded in her lap and her chin was slightly tilted, the way it always was when she was deciding something. She looked up at him. "Did you say yes to something?" she said. "Yes." She considered this. Then she nodded, once the same nod she used for facts she had filed and accepted. She reached up and took his hand. They sat together for a while longer, until the light began to thin and the harbor lamps flickered on one by one along the quay. Then they walked home, and he made dinner, and she told him about the article in more detail than the printout contained, because she had asked the librarian questions, and she always asked questions. He listened to every word. That night, after she was asleep, he opened his laptop and wrote 2 emails. The first went to Isabel Rue, who had been his deputy coordinator at IMRO for 6 years, and who had sent him a birthday message every year since he left, even the years he hadn't replied. The second took him longer to write. The name at the top of it was Peter Haas. Thomas had trained Haas himself in the early years, when Haas was still learning to read current charts, and Thomas was the one who had taught him how. They had not spoken since Thomas resigned. Haas had sent a condolence card when Adele died. Thomas had not responded to that either. He typed the email in 3 sentences. He read it back once. Then he sent it, closed the laptop, and went to bed. He did not sleep easily, but he slept. The operations center occupied the top floor of a building 2 blocks from the Port Authority offices, and it smelled of recycled air and cold coffee, and the particular tension of people who had been working through the night without resolution. Thomas arrived at 7:15. Carl met him at the door and walked him in without ceremony. The room was large and utilitarian, long tables arranged in a U-shape, monitors on the far wall showing weather overlays and vessel tracking displays, fluorescent strips overhead that gave everything the color of exhaustion. 6 people were already at their stations. Renata Claus stood at the head of the room with her arms crossed, watching Thomas the way she had watched him on the access road, with the focused patience of someone deciding what she was looking at. Peter Haas was at the central table. Thomas had not seen him in 7 years. Haas had filled out slightly, and his hair was shorter than Thomas remembered, and he wore a jacket that fit him the way expensive jackets fitted men who needed people to notice them. He looked up when Thomas entered. Something crossed his face and settled back almost before it was visible. "Thomas," he said, "neutral, professional." The voice of a man who had prepared for this. "Pieter," Thomas said. Renata introduced Thomas to the room in 2 sentences. She did not explain where he had come from or what he had previously done. She said only that he would be reviewing the coordination data and that the team would give him what he needed. No one objected aloud. Haas looked at his monitor. Thomas sat at the table and pulled the drift projection files toward him. He read without speaking. The room continued around him, low voices, keyboard sounds, the occasional crackle from the communication console. A young analyst brought him a printout of the current tables being used. He set it beside the projection model and read both at the same time, moving between them with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this thousands of times. 18 minutes later, he set both documents down. "These are the wrong tables," he said. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something is said that cannot be taken back. Haas looked up. "We're using the certified regional tables, the same source we've used for 2 years. "You're using the autumn tables," Thomas said. "The storm corridor runs a northern drift pattern from the first week of October. We're past that date. The current has shifted." He tapped the projection map. "Your search grid is 40 kilometers south of where the vessel will be." Haas's expression didn't change, but the stillness in it sharpened. "Our data team reviewed the tables this morning. The source is certified. I'd like to see the source file." A pause. Brief, but there. "Of course," Haas said. He pulled up the file and turned his monitor so Thomas could see it. Thomas leaned forward. He read the header, the methodology notes, the revision history at the bottom of the document. He looked at the revision timestamp. Then he looked at the filing date printed on the cover page. The timestamp was 3 days newer than the filing date. Someone had modified the file after it was officially submitted. The modification was small, a parameter change in the seasonal shift calculation. the kind of adjustment that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking at. Thomas said nothing about the timestamp. He picked up the grease pencil from the table, turned to the chart on the wall, and drew a new search grid, 43 kilometers north-northeast of the current one. He marked the center point and the recommended sweep radius and set the pencil down. "Redeploy to this grid," he said. "Both vessels. Now, if possible." Haas stood. "That recommendation is based on a disputed reading of the current data. I have to object formally before any redeployment order is issued." Renata looked at Haas. Then she looked at Thomas. Then she looked at the chart. "Redeploy," she said. Haas held her gaze for 1 second. Then he sat down. The room moved. Analysts reached for phones and radios. Carl stepped to the communication console and began the redeployment sequence with the vessel commanders. The energy in the space shifted from the flat exhaustion of a stalled operation to something tighter and more purposeful. Thomas stood at the chart. He didn't look at Haas. Haas gathered his files. He did it slowly, with the deliberate composure of a man who refused to look rushed in public. He said something to the analyst beside him. Something about the documentation process, the formal objection record, the institutional protocol that needed to be followed. His voice was steady and precise. A man performing normalcy. He picked up his phone and walked toward the door. At the glass partition that separated the main room from the corridor, he stopped. He looked back, not at the chart, not at Renata, at Thomas. It lasted only a moment. Then he turned and walked into the corridor, raised his phone to his ear, and was gone. Renata came to stand beside Thomas at the chart. She looked at the new grid he had drawn. "How certain are you?" she said. "Certain enough." She nodded once and walked away. Thomas kept his eyes on the chart. The vessels were being repositioned. The crews were moving. Somewhere out in the storm corridor off the Corsican coast, 34 people were waiting in conditions that were getting worse by the hour. And somewhere in the corridor behind the glass, Peter Haas was on a call that no one in the room had heard him make. If you stayed with this story so far, don't go anywhere, because what happens in the next hour will change everything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part, and tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone try to cover something up and known, before anyone else did, exactly what they were hiding? Drop it below. I want to know. The first confirmation came at 11:43. A radio operator in the far corner of the room pressed his headset tighter to his ear and held up one hand. Everyone looked at him. "Lead vessel is picking up a beacon signal," he said. "Faint. But it's there." Thomas was already at the chart. He looked at the coordinates the operator read out. They were 2 kilometers inside the corrected grid. He said nothing. He drew a small circle on the chart at the beacon's position and set down the pencil. Renata stood behind him. She looked at the circle. Then she looked at where the original search grid had been, 43 kilometers south. She said nothing either. For 11 minutes, the room worked with the focused energy of people who could see the end of something. The radio operators relayed positioning data to the vessel commanders. The lead vessel moved toward the beacon. A second vessel was directed to hold position 2 kilometers north, ready to assist with recovery. Thomas watched the tracking monitor. His hands were flat on the table. At 11:54, the signal dropped. Not faded. Dropped. One moment it was there, weak but steady, and then it was gone, replaced by static that had a different texture than weather interference, a flatness to it, mechanical rather than natural. "What happened?" Renata said. The radio operator tried 3 frequencies, same static on all 3. He looked up. "We've lost contact with both vessels." Thomas straightened. He looked at the communications console, then at the Port Authority relay display on the monitor to his left. Something in the relay routing table was wrong. The signal was being accepted at the primary hub, and then rerouted not forward to the vessels, but sideways, into a secondary buffer that was set to receive only. He crossed to Carl. "The relay has been rerouted," he said quietly. "The interference is coming from inside this building." Carl looked at him. Then he turned to the junior analyst at the security console. "Pull the workstation logs," he said. "All stations. Last 6 hours." The analyst worked fast. The logs appeared on screen, timestamped by timestamp. Every action taken at every workstation in the room. Carl leaned over the analyst's shoulder and scrolled. He stopped. Thomas came to look. Haas's workstation log showed two things. The first was the drift projection files. Not the version Haas had shown Thomas that morning, but the original, unmodified source. The seasonal shift parameter had been changed 4 days ago, 3 days before the MV. Adele went dark, not after the crisis began, before. The second was a communications relay command entered 40 minutes ago, while the redeployed vessels were still transiting to the corrected grid. The command had rerouted the primary coordination channel to the buffer. It had been entered quietly, between two routine data queries. The kind of action that would look like a system adjustment to anyone watching casually. Thomas looked at the cargo manifest pinned to the board beside the main display. He had glanced at it when he arrived and noted only the standard entries. He looked at it properly now. Midway down the second page, marked under a customs exemption code he recognized from ports he had worked in the South Atlantic, was a secondary freight entry. No weight, no declared value. An exemption code that meant the cargo had been pre-cleared without inspection. He understood. Haas had not wanted the MV Adele found. Not quickly, not by official channels, not before certain arrangements could be made regarding what was in the hold. Thomas set the manifest down. "Show her," he said to Carl. Carl printed the workstation log and the unmodified drift file and carried them to Renata. She read both documents standing up, without sitting, without asking Carl to explain what she was looking at. She was a woman who had spent 40 years reading documents that mattered. She understood this one within 90 seconds. Her face gave nothing away, not anger, not shock, just the careful blankness of a person processing information that has consequences she cannot yet see the full shape of. "Secure the building," she said. Carl turned to the door. The corridor beyond the glass partition was empty. Haas was already gone. Carl moved fast, speaking into his radio as he went. 2 of his people appeared from the stairwell. They fanned out. 3 minutes later, Carl came back to the glass and shook his head once. Thomas turned to the communications console. He looked at the relay routing display. The interference was still active. The vessels were still dark. The beacon they had found, the one that had put 34 crew members within reach, was sitting in a storm corridor off the Corsican coast, with no one talking to it. He looked at the clock on the wall, 12:17 in the afternoon. He knew the MV Adele's last confirmed condition from the distress protocol filed before she went dark. He knew the storm's progression rate from the weather overlays. He knew the exposure tolerance for a crew sheltering in a vessel that size in those sea conditions. The math was not difficult. He had done it before, in other corridors, with other ships, with other clocks on other walls. 4 hours. After 4 hours, the calculus of survival would begin to change in ways that no amount of coordination could reverse. He pulled a chair to the communications console and sat down. There was another way in. The secondary relay channel was frequency 56.8 MHz. Thomas knew this, the way he knew the names of ships by their silhouettes, not because he had looked it up recently, but because some knowledge settled so deep into a person that it stopped being memory and became something closer to instinct. 7 years ago, coordinating a recovery operation in this same corridor during a winter storm, he had used that frequency when the primary channel degraded. The port authorities still maintained it. It would not be affected by whatever Haas had rerouted. He told Carl. Carl made 2 calls. 3 minutes later, a Port Authority technician at the relay station switched the channel to active and patched it through to the operations center console. Thomas put on the headset. Static. Then, beneath the static, the shape of a carrier wave. He adjusted the gain, slowly, the way you turned a dial when you were listening for something specific and did not want to overshoot it. A voice came through, broken, weather distorted, but there. This is MV Adele. This is MV Adele. We are holding position. We have injured crew. Repeat, we have injured crew. Is anyone receiving? Thomas pressed the transmit key. MV Adele, this is coordination. We have you. Stand by. The room went very still. He didn't look up. He pulled the chart toward him and oriented himself against the beacon coordinates from the last confirmed signal. He looked at the weather overlay. The storm had tracked north-northeast at 11 knots since the morning reading. He calculated the vessel's drift from the beacon position forward through the hours of silence. He keyed the radio again and gave the lead rescue vessel a new intercept heading, bearing 274. Speed reduced to 8 knots on approach to manage the wave sets. He told them what they would find when they arrived. A vessel listing slightly to port based on the distress protocol filed at departure. Crew sheltering below deck, potentially one or more injured requiring assisted evacuation. The vessel commander asked how he knew the list direction. Her ballast configuration is in the original manifest, Thomas said. She'll take on water to port first in this sea state. Trust it. A pause on the line. Copy that, the commander said, adjusting approach. Renata had moved to stand behind the radio console. Carl stood 2 steps to her left. Neither of them spoke. The analysts at their stations had stopped their own tasks and were watching Thomas, not their monitors, the way people watch something they don't fully understand but recognize as important. The next hour moved in the particular way that rescue operations moved, not quickly, but with density, each minute containing more information and decision than an ordinary hour held in a week. Thomas directed the lead vessel through the approach sequence, reading the storm's behavior from the wave interval. Reports the commander relayed back every 4 minutes, adjusting the approach angle twice as the swell pattern shifted. He positioned the second vessel 200 meters north on a holding arc, ready to move into recovery position once the lead vessel had the MV Adele's crew in sight. He spoke in short, specific sentences. Bearings, distances, timing windows. He never raised his voice. At one point, Renata leaned forward to ask something. Carl put his hand on her arm gently and shook his head once. She straightened and waited. The radio crackled. Coordination, we have visual on MV Adele. Thomas closed his eyes for 1 second, then he opened them. Initiate crew transfer. Lead vessel takes port side. Secondary vessel holds arc and comes in on my mark for overflow recovery. What followed was methodical and precise, and, to anyone listening without understanding the variables Thomas was managing simultaneously, unremarkable. But Carl Dietrich had spent 20 years in maritime law enforcement. He understood what he was hearing. He understood the storm data, the positioning geometry, the timing of the recovery windows between the wave sets that Thomas called with an accuracy that the vessel commanders confirmed each time without question. He stood very still and listened to a man do something extraordinary while sounding like he was doing something ordinary. The confirmations came one by one. Crew member transferred. Crew member transferred. The radio operator kept a tally on a notepad, making a mark for each confirmation, and the marks accumulated with agonizing slowness. And then, as the recovery rhythm found its pace, with increasing speed. At the 30-second confirmation, someone in the room made a sound, not quite a word, just a breath that had nowhere else to go. At the 34th, the lead vessel commander's voice came through with a different quality than all the transmissions before it. Coordination. 34 crew accounted for. All personnel transferred. MV Adele is secured for tow. Thomas set down the headset. He placed it on the console with both hands, carefully, the way you set something down when your hands need a moment to remember what stillness feels like. The room was quiet. Not the tight, held quiet of people waiting, but the open quiet of people who have been carrying something heavy and have just been allowed to put it down. Renata stepped forward. She looked at Thomas for a long moment, the same measuring look she had given him on the access road 2 days ago, beside her car in the afternoon light. The same look, but now she had the answer to the question she hadn't known she was asking then. "What is your name?" she said. Not a question she didn't know the answer to, a question she wanted to hear him answer himself, in this room, on this night. "Thomas Aubert," he said. She nodded. She picked up her phone and walked to the corridor to call her board. Carl stayed. He crossed to the filing table along the wall where the documents from the morning had been stacked. He found what he was looking for and carried it back to the console. He set it in front of Thomas and slid it across the surface. It was the IMRO commendation, Thomas's photograph in the upper corner, his name beneath the seal of 2 international organizations. The dates of 14 operations running across 8 years in seas that had no patience for people who were anything less than exactly what they claimed to be. Carl said nothing. He didn't need to. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in January, Peter Haas walked into a preliminary legal hearing at the Marseille courthouse with his lawyer on one side and a court officer on the other. He was dressed the way he had always dressed. Dark jacket, no wasted detail. His face was composed in the careful way of a man who had decided some time ago that composure was the only position still available to him. He did not look at the small group of journalists near the entrance. He did not look at Karl Dietrich, who stood on the far side of the courtyard with his hands in his coat pockets, and watched him go in. The charges were maritime fraud, obstruction of emergency rescue operations, and undisclosed cargo falsification. The preliminary hearing would take an hour. The trial, when it came, would take considerably longer. Carl watched the door close behind Haas. Then he turned and walked back toward the port. Thomas did not go to the courthouse. He had been asked by 2 different lawyers whether he wanted to observe. He had said no both times. He had work to do. The IMRO Regional Coordination Office occupied a corner suite on the 3rd floor of a building that faced the harbor directly, close enough that on clear days you could read the names on the ships at the nearest berths without a glass. The office had been Renata's idea, formalized in a single phone call she made to the IMRO Executive Board the morning after the rescue, before she had slept, before she had changed out of the clothes she had worn through the night. She had not framed it as a request. Thomas had been named director 6 weeks later. He had accepted in the same way he accepted most things, without ceremony, with a single nod, and then by going directly to work. He still lived in the same apartment. He still walked Cleo to school on the same route, past the bakery on Rue Bernard, past the corner where she always took his hand without looking. The route was unchanged. The man walking it was the same man, and also not quite the same man, and he had made a quiet peace with both of those things being true simultaneously. On his desk there was now a photograph in a small wooden frame. It was the same photograph that had been in the locked box under his bed for 4 years. Adele in the hospital chair, the blue scarf, Cleo asleep across her lap. That expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough. He had placed it in the upper left corner of the desk, where he could see it when he looked up from his work. Not always. Just when he looked up. Isabelle Roux arrived at 3:30, which was when she always arrived, because Isabelle had kept the same schedule for 15 years regardless of what else was happening around her. She set a file folder on the desk without preamble. It was thin. A single operation. The first official case file for the new office. A vessel in distress off the Spanish coast. A coordination request from the Regional Maritime Authority. "First one," she said. Thomas looked at the folder. He opened it and read the first page. The door from the corridor opened and Cleo came in, still wearing her school bag, her jacket half unzipped from the walk up the stairs. She looked at the room with the focused interest she brought to all new spaces, even this one, which she had visited twice before and had therefore already begun to consider familiar. She went straight to the window. The harbor was gray and bright in the January light, the water moving in its slow, patient way, the ships sitting heavy and still at their berths. Cleo pressed one hand against the glass and looked out. "That one's the Aegean Promise," she said. She came back. Thomas looked up from the file. The Aegean Promise was at berth 4, right where he had told Cleo she would be. 3 months ago, on a morning that felt much further away than that. He had not mentioned it since. Cleo had remembered on her own. "She did," he said. Cleo moved her gaze to the next berth. She studied the hull, the funnel, the flag. "I don't know that one," she said. "The Santa Vera, Portuguese registry. She came in this morning." Cleo repeated it carefully and looked at the ship for another moment, filing it away. Then she turned from the window and looked at the photograph on his desk. Adele, the blue scarf, the sleeping child who was her own younger self, unaware of being watched. Cleo looked at the photograph the way she looked at most things she had already decided to accept. She didn't say anything. She sat down in the chair beside the desk and took a book from her bag and began to read. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then he looked back at the file. Isabel stood by the door, her coat still on, waiting without impatience. He read to the end of the first page. He turned to the second. Then he closed the file, picked up the phone, and dialed the number for the Regional Maritime Authority. Outside the window, the harbor moved in its slow and ancient way. The Santa Vera sat at her berth. The Aegean Promise sat at hers. The water held them all, the way it always had, indifferent to names and titles and the long distances a person could travel between who they were and who they were always going to become. Thomas spoke into the phone. He gave his name. He said he was calling about the coordination request. He said he was ready to begin. "We don't outrun the thing we were made to do. We only delay the moment it finds us again."